Hello, everyone. Welcome to my 517 Follow Friday series. Today, I am joined by Kim Barber from Globetrotter Travel, and Kim plans trips, manages travel arrangements for destinations all over the globe. Kim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I think the best thing to start with today is just a better understanding of what it means to work with someone like you, to work with a travel agent. I have never worked with a travel agent before. I've always just assumed that it was only meant for like really expensive trips or if you're traveling internationally, just something big. So, talk to me about the process and just kind of clear up some of these misconceptions that I'm sure other people have. It's not just me.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I do a lot of networking and talks, and one of the biggest misconceptions I have to clear up is kind of that it doesn't necessarily, in most cases, it doesn't cost more to work with a travel agent. There are some agents kind of in recent years, mostly post pandemic, who have implemented some fees, and I definitely understand the reasons behind that. But basically, at our simplest form, I always tell people we're commission based salespeople. So I like to think that from a service level, we provide kind of a better service kind of throughout the process than maybe your typical I don't know, I don't want to throw any industries under the bus, but some other commission based salespeople, where it might be like a one time interaction and then the sale is done.
Mhm.
We are kind of commission based salespeople, but also the main part of working with an agent is the service you get kind of before, during, and after a trip. And then in the unlikely event, but increasing in frequency, in the event where maybe an airline issue arises or a flight gets canceled, we're kind of there to be the main point of contact and to help kind of get that issue resolved as quickly as possible. So, yes, one of the biggest misconceptions that I'm constantly clearing up is that it does not cost more to work with an agent. There's always a commission built into the price of travel, regardless of how or where you book it. And what a lot of people I think don't realize, I mean, since you can book travel on the internet,
Mhm.
a lot of people, that's just how they book their travel. But if you're booking through Expedia, Priceline, Travelocity, those are online travel agencies.
Right.
So they're getting the commission. You're just, the main difference is they're paying their employees an hourly rate, and the larger company is keeping the commission. And
Right.
very often, and I've actually gained a lot of clients post pandemic from people who previously booked with those sorts of online travel agencies, but when things do go wrong, the customers or service is maybe leaving a little bit to be desired. So really, there's always a commission built into the price of travel, regardless of how you book. So working with an agent kind of ensures that you're getting a service that you're paying for.
Right. So you mentioned commission quite a few times. How does that work? Is this like a commission that, let's say I want to fly to Florida and go to Disney. So do you get a commission from the airline because you're booking directly with them? And then do you get a commission from whatever hotel and then Disney World? How does that work?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so airlines are kind of the exception. Airlines previously, at a point prior to me being in the travel industry, like 13 years ago, airlines once really did pay commissions. Now they've
Okay.
really cut, actually, ever since 9/11, they've really cut back on commissions. There are like still a handful of scenarios where you might get a 2% commission or something quite small on the percentage scale from an airline. But mostly, I mean, all hotels, all resorts, Walt Disney ticket packages, that's kind of where a cruise lines, there's always commission built into those items. And I
Okay.
guess the exception to the airline piece of it is if you book if you're going to an all-inclusive resort and you book your flight and your resort together, you're getting access to a contracted rate. So the rate for the flights is a little bit less, the rate on the resort is a little bit less, and then there's kind of a commission built into the whole package. So whether you come to me and book an Apple, because Apple Vacations, for example, has nonstop charter flights that go out of Lansing in the winter to Cancun and Punta Cana in Jamaica. Whether you come to me to book that trip or you go to applevacations.com directly, the price is identical. The
Okay.
commission is identical. But again, it's just that matter of if you want one person to kind of manage your trip throughout the process, or if you just want to, call into a call center for support and things that you might need.
Right. So just kind of that more personal aspect, if I'm
Exactly.
stranded somewhere or something goes wrong, do I want to call you and cry to you or do I want to call
Sure.
to the
And
resort or
I hope
something.
that doesn't happen, but I always tell people, and increasingly in this post-pandemic world that we live in, where there's fewer flights than ever before, and the price of the
Mhm.
flights is higher. We always hope that things are going to go according to plan, but that's rarely the case with travel.
Yeah.
Usually, especially, the more destinations you have, or the longer your trip, the more opportunities there are for things to go wrong. So, certainly knowing that you can reach out to, someone who is going to answer the phone, or you can send them a text. I mean, because I always have my clients text me when they're traveling. One way or another, you can get a hold of me, and I can kind of work behind the scenes to get things corrected as quickly as possible.
Okay.
Yeah,
So, what kind of people do you typically work with? I mean,
yeah.
families, is it, do you do a lot of honeymoons? Is it, or is it more tied to times of the year, like Christmas and spring break and things like that? Who do you work with?
Yeah, so I work with a little bit of everybody. I do a lot of honeymoons. I do a lot of destination weddings. I average about 8 to 10 destination wedding groups every year. So that's kind of an increasing segment of my business. But a lot of honeymoons, and then a lot of families too, and a lot of multi-generational families. Like
Oh,
grandparents who are retired and have kids and grandkids, and they want to take everybody on a trip.
mhm.
That's kind of a group trip that I'm planning more and more often. So generally speaking, the segment that I'm most working with is leisure travelers. So families, couples, multi-generational families. And then I do have a smaller segment of my business that is corporate travel. I
Okay.
don't do, I work with about 4 different companies right now on their corporate travel as well. Some incentive trips for, people who are salesmen, or saleswomen, salespeople, I suppose, who are, in an industry where there's, their employer wants to do an incentive trip. And then I also work with some other corporate, companies, more so post pandemic, now that travel has come back,
Mm,
to plan, their business trips and things like that.
okay.
Yeah.
Are there locations anywhere, whether it's domestic or international, that are kind of like your specialty that
Absolutely.
you like to
Yeah.
make arrangements for?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because, there's some agents who only do cruises, and there's some people who only do resorts. And I do a little bit of everything. I mean, I dabble in it all. I've sold 7 continents. I've planned trips, to all 7 continents, but I haven't been everywhere for as much as I would love to. And for as much as I love to travel and I try to go to new places, I haven't been everywhere. So sometimes I get a request for a new to me destination. And that's kind of a fun challenge for me. But so I do a little bit of everything, but there are certainly destinations and sort of segments of the industry that I specialize in more so than others. So Australia and New Zealand is kind of where I got
Mm,
started. I lived in Australia and New Zealand and worked for travel companies there. So Australia and New Zealand is a big part of my business. But in 2020, when the world shut down, Australia and New Zealand remained closed for longer than most other countries. So I really had to shift
okay.
a lot of my business that was previously to Australia and New Zealand, to other parts of the world. So I do a lot of safaris in Africa. That's another area that I'm really passionate about, and one of my favorite trips to plan. But being where we are in mid Michigan, a lot of people want to get away in the winter. So a
Mhm.
lot of Mexico and the Caribbean, all inclusive kind of trips. I mentioned earlier, there's nonstop flights from the Lansing airport that go to Cancun and the Dominican and Jamaica seasonally. So I do a
Mhm.
lot of that, a lot of cruises. And then I plan a lot domestically throughout the US as well. So, I mean, as far as destinations that I specialize in, really Mexico, Caribbean, Australia, New Zealand, Tahiti, and Africa are like my passions, I suppose. I do a lot of Europe. I love Europe as well. So, I mean, I dabble in everything, but there's certainly those areas that I really, really personally enjoy planning trips to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I saw you shared with me a little bit about bucket list travel.
Yeah.
And people talk about it all the time. Like they want to go here or there and it's on their bucket list. For probably a decade or so now, I've had this goal of going to all 50 states by the time I'm 50. And I was adding them up before our video today, and I think I'm at 22. But
Okay.
um, a lot of those are from when I was a kid. I had like a driving trip with my grandparents to Florida. So, we went down one way and up the other. And so half of them are from that. Um, and then, there's some places internationally that my husband and I have talked about visiting. How, for someone like me that has a lot of states they still want to hit, especially I haven't gone to Alaska or Hawaii yet. Um, and eventually I'd like to do some international travel. What kind of recommendations do you have for like saving up for this, or are there financing options? Like how do I make this happen?
Yeah, good question. There are financing options. It's a little bit different based on, depending on which travel supplier has the best, you know, price for a particular destination or a trip or anything like that. But in general, most suppliers you can pay when you're planning a trip, you can pay a minimum upfront deposit, usually as low as, well, depending on cruises, it can be as low as $25 per person.
Wow.
But for like a flight and resort trip, it can be as low as $200 per person. So you can pay a minimum upfront deposit, and that locks in your price. It locks in your airfare, your resort. It locks in your reservation and the price. And then the final payment in general wouldn't be due until somewhere between 45 days and 60 days prior to travel. So
Okay.
if you plan, I mean, airfare is released in general. Southwest is kind of the exception to this, but airfare in general is released 11 months prior to your travel dates. So if you start planning 11 months before, put a deposit down on a trip, that basically gives you almost a year to kind of save up and make
Right.
payments on your trip. And I always say, because people ask me this a lot, like, which as far as the supplier is concerned, say it's a cruise, it's Norwegian Cruise Line, for example, they only care really about the initial deposit date and the final payment date. Beyond that, you can make as many or as few payments in between those two dates as you want to. So I think a lot of people don't realize this is kind of something that maybe an online travel agency doesn't provide in a lot of cases. But when you work with an advisor who works partners with a bunch of different suppliers, that is something that you kind of have the benefit of having those payment plan options.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what would you say is maybe one of the most difficult aspects of travel, or like a challenge that either you face or your clients face when making arrangements? And if there's something different, whether it's domestic versus international, like I'd love to hear about this too.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I like to say that I think we're kind of past the worst of the pandemic challenges that we faced. I mean, that was certainly its own set of challenges for a couple of years there, but now I guess what I'm seeing is sort of aftermath of the pandemic is that there are fewer flights operating than
Mhm.
there were before. Just thinking about the Lansing airport, there used to be multiple flights every, like for Delta, for example, had flights to Detroit and Minneapolis on average 8 to 9 a day. As far as I know, they're still down to 2 a day, and they removed the Minneapolis flight, and they have not resumed that yet. So there's just, and United Airlines was in the Lansing airport pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. They've pulled out, so they used to do
Wow.
Lansing to Chicago 2 or 3 times a day, and they're no longer operating there. So there's just fewer flights out there. I know there's a pilot shortage. I know airlines are struggling to, retain staff, like everybody's
Yeah.
struggling with staffing. So you kind of see everywhere on the news, and flight prices are at an all-time high. I mean, just regardless, domestic, international, no matter where you're looking to go, prices for flights are just, they're high right now because there's fewer flights. There's not enough pilots, and so that's a big challenge, because people want to travel, and then they start, you start getting quotes, and you're seeing flight prices that are 40% higher than they were a year ago at this time, and that's a big objection to overcome. But I guess the other side of that is, you never know when a worldwide pandemic is going to come and
Yeah.
kind of shut down travel. For a year, 2 years at a time in the case of New Zealand, Australia. So I think I guess the other side of that is I'm seeing a lot of people who are like, this is on my bucket list. I've always sort of had this mentality, oh, I'll get to it. And then, the pandemic happens, the world shuts down. And so I'm getting a lot of people who are like, I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait. I don't want to put off these trips. You never
Mhm.
know. I mean, obviously, a lot of people got sick during the pandemic. And so I'm seeing a lot of that as well. So I think one of the biggest challenges right now is domestic and internationally, just airfare and the price, and the fact that there's fewer flights going than before. Um, that's the main one. I mean, the other one, I guess, and the difference between domestic and internationally on this one is domestically traveling within the U.S. Most hotels and resorts, they will guarantee a bedding request. So, for example, if there's a
Oh,
family of four and you need two doubles in a room, you could just book a two double room. Um, In Mexico and the Caribbean, there are a handful of resorts that will guarantee a bedding request, but more often they won't guarantee a bedding request. So you might book, you put in 4 people in the search and you book the room for 4 people. And then it's a request for 2 double beds, and there's really no guarantee because they kind of,
Oh,
they see kids 12 and under as kids, and they just figure, oh, they can sleep on the couch or whatever. So that's one of the biggest challenges that I face booking a lot of Mexico and the Caribbean. I try and, whenever possible, book those resorts that will guarantee a bedding request, but it's not always possible to. Not every resort guarantees it, so that's a big challenge that I face when I'm booking families, or even like a women's trip. I have a women's trip coming up next week with about 28 women going, sharing rooms, and they won't guarantee, double beds versus a king bed. So
right.
that's one of the biggest challenges I face. But certainly, I think, again, the difference between booking online or booking with an agent, I have contacts at those resorts. I can put in
Right.
the requests. I do put in the requests. It does not mean they're guaranteed, but I do think the likelihood of getting the room that you are requesting is more of a possibility when you've got an agent who's, reaching out 2 or 3
Hmm.
times before your trip to kind of reiterate those requests.
Right. So it's not in that situation, it's not necessarily that you could end up in a room that's not like rated safely for that number of people. It just might mean that somebody's sleeping on a couch or something like that.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. Like in the case of this women's trip I have coming up next week, the room it's I mean, a lot of people who go to a resort like that are in a couple. So if I were traveling with
Hmm.
my husband, king bed is fine. I'm traveling with a friend. I'm rooming with a friend on this trip. I mean, if we have worst case scenario, we sleep together in a king bed. It's not the end of the world,
Right.
but a lot of when I first started traveling with her a few years ago, I mean, maybe now I'm more comfortable doing that than I was, the first time I shared a room with her. So that's just one of the bigger challenges I think of, being that I plan so many trips to Mexico and the Dominican, and there's different, a lot of them are for couples, but a lot are for families. Trying to just get a handle on the bedding that is in the actual room,
Right.
is one of the bigger challenges.
Okay. So I was going to ask you about airlines, but you made me think of something else.
Yeah.
So my husband mentioned something the other day about this like train trip that's international, somewhere like Europe, Germany, like it goes all over the place. How often do you plan trips where it's not airline that's being used as the mode of transportation? And I don't know what there is domestically for um, trains that you can sleep on. I know that, the Amtrak goes to Chicago, but how often do you plan trips where they're getting around in a bus or a train or something?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's pretty rare that I would plan a trip that didn't have some kind of air. I mean, I guess to answer that, Amtrak does have sleeper cabins within the U.S.
Okay.
It's not, Europe has a much better train system than we do. And so it's pretty common that I plan trips to Europe where obviously people are flying over,
Right.
but then they're using trains while they're there to get between destinations or countries. So I use train travel a lot in Europe. That's probably the biggest destination. But then, there's parts of Africa that kind of have some luxury trains. So train travel is really more at this point, I think, with the exception of Europe, when it's just like a mode of transportation between two cities or something. Like in Africa, there's this Rovos rail. It's a luxury train experience. There's one in Canada called Rocky Mountaineer that is, again, a really nice kind of luxury train experience. A lot of people would do like an Alaska cruise tour, and after the cruise, they
Okay.
do a land portion of the trip, and there's a train incorporated to that. So Amtrak does have some sleeper cabins within the US. It's rare that I would plan them because, in all honesty, they're usually fairly expensive, and it's really, I guess I could probably count on 2 hands the number of times I've planned like overnight train trips within the U.S. But Amtrak Rail does offer that. It's in my experience when I've booked it for people, it's people who have just a petrifying fear of flying, and so their
Okay.
only option really to get somewhere is to travel by train. And certainly, I think that if you pay to have the sleeper cabin, it is a nicer experience than just paying for your seat. But from a cost perspective, it's usually quite a bit more than airline flying to your destination, and obviously takes quite a bit longer as well. So it's not the most popular mode of transport in the US, but that being said, there are a handful of kind of luxury train experiences. The Rocky Mountaineer in Canada, there's a Belmont one in Peru. So those are kind of increasing in popularity as well.
Okay. So, okay, let's talk airlines now. The
Yeah.
new one in Lansing is a Velo, however you say it. So if you're comfortable with sharing, what would you say is the best overall airline, and which one would you say to avoid?
Yes. I'm happy to answer that based on my experience. I find
Okay.
that this is very, this just depends on your experience, really. So for us in Michigan, we have Delta hubs in Detroit. So Delta, in my experience, is the most reliable for us in Michigan. I mean, I like to fly out of Lansing whenever possible. Post pandemic, it has become a bit challenging because there are so many fewer flights than there were before. Often I drive to Grand Rapids or Detroit, but yeah, I mean, especially out of Detroit, we have a Delta hub. You can
Mhm.
fly nonstop to a lot of places out of Detroit. I just took my almost 1 year old son on his first flight over the weekend. And of course, worried about traveling with an infant for the first time. So we drove to Detroit so we could get a nonstop flight to Florida, because we were going to West Palm, which the Avelo Airlines out of Lansing does not go into West Palm Beach. But
Okay.
so I think that Delta in Michigan is one of our better options. It's my preference. Whenever possible, I will choose to fly Delta. Um, for me, airlines to avoid, the ones that I have had, and I've actually never flown with Frontier, but I have had some bad client experiences with them. Sometimes people, I mean, you see that initial price when you're searching for a flight, Frontier comes up, Spirit, whoever.
Yeah.
Um, in my experience, any of those budget airlines are not ideal. They're less reliable. And the other piece of that is where Delta, maybe, you fly Delta out of Detroit. If your flight gets canceled or delayed, you have other options. Delta has,
Right.
numerous flights going every day. Whereas Frontier or Spirit, even if, I mean, if you're going out of Detroit, they might only have one, two, three flights a day that would get to your destination. So when things don't go according to plan, it's harder to come back from that. So in my experience, Frontier is among the worst. I will avoid them at all costs. If I have a client that comes to me and they specifically request that they want Frontier, I ultimately am usually just telling them at this point, book those directly with the airline, because in the event that things go wrong, then you can just work with them directly to get
Right.
things corrected. So Frontier is among the worst in my experience. Allegiant is not much better. A lot of people in mid Michigan, or kind of West Michigan, I suppose, like Allegiant because they have nonstop flights from Grand Rapids to some smaller airports in
Mhm.
Florida. And when they go, they're great. The price is right. They're great. But when they don't go, it's 3 days before the next one goes. So
Right.
I've had some people get burned by those cancellations as well. So it's ultimately a matter of determining if the savings up front is worth the risk of, if things go wrong, knowing that you would lose 3 to 4 days.
Right. Yeah. I've flown Delta a couple of times, and that I love Delta, but I'm also a very fearful flyer. I get nervous at
Right.
every little bit of turbulence. So it's kind of silly, but I love that they have the little screens on the back of every chair, and I can
Oh
watch
yeah.
my plane that I'm in flying where I'm flying. I don't know why. It's not, there's something comforting about that. And
I
we
love to
haven't
do that
flown.
too. Like
Yeah.
whether it's, yeah, sorry, whether it's domestic or international, I love to watch the flight mapper. And
Yeah.
honestly, this past weekend traveling with my, 1 year old, almost 1 year old son for the first time, just watching that tracker and watching the
Mhm.
time, the
Yep.
minutes remaining in the flight, that was just nice for me to be able to kind of have that visual.
Right. Yeah, and I think I'm pretty sure it's Delta also. I don't think it's Southwest, but they also have like free videos and there's little games and stuff on that little screen. And so I've said repeatedly that if we fly with kids, if we ever take the boys, which none of them have flown yet, it's got to be Delta because I'm not going to try to juggle and the Amazon Kindles and the iPads and making sure they're charged and whether or not they're going to work and everything. I just feel like it has the appearance of being very family friendly. Um,
Yeah.
And I've flown Southwest a couple of times. The thing that I don't like, and maybe it's different now, but the thing I didn't like about Southwest is you don't get to pick your seat. You have to like, what is it, like 24 hours ahead of time? You have to log in and you're fighting everybody else to be like A, B, C group, whatever. And then
Mhm.
you just board in a group and you pick whatever seat you want. I don't like that. Um,
Yeah.
so okay. What about the pandemic? So you've mentioned it a couple of times, like how it more strongly affected Australia, New Zealand. Do you feel like, aside from the lack of flights, do you feel like travel is coming back, that the industry is rebounding? What kind of
Yeah.
restrictions are still out there?
Yeah. I absolutely feel like the industry has bounced back and then some. I mean, 2019 was I started my business in 2015. Increasingly years were better and better. 2019 was my best year on record. I was on track to break all these records in 2020, and then obviously the pandemic happened. But
Right.
honestly, 21 and 22 have been consecutively my two best years on record now. And I think, there's always some, with, especially with a business, you're kind of aiming for that growth year after year. But
Yep.
2020, we did not see growth. But then, as soon as the restrictions started being lifted in 2021 and 2022, yeah, a lot of people who had previously booked online and had really bad experiences when the pandemic hit, and lost their money or couldn't get through to
Yep.
a customer service agent, they've started coming to book trips with our agency. And then on top of that, like I mentioned earlier, people who had kind of been putting trips off, oh, I'll get to it. They're like, no, I'm not going to wait anymore. So, yeah, the amount, I mean, without giving like numbers, I mean, in 2021, I sold about 500 $1,000, I guess, more. I guess that is a number, Kim. I sold quite a bit more than I had in 2019. And then in 2021 just came back with a boom. And then last year, I set a pretty lofty goal, which was to kind of double what I had done in 2021, and I hit it and then some. And so,
Awesome.
it's interesting. It has definitely come back. And as far as restrictions go, um, there's really very few left. There's a handful of destinations that still have some kind of minimal testing or vaccination restrictions, but it is there's maybe 4 or 5 countries that are still kind of enforcing anything like that. So we were just talking about it last week, this women's trip that I have leaving next week. Last year when we left Mexico, we had to take a COVID test to come back into the US. And that's been gone for probably 10 months now. So I had a pre-departure meeting with this group before we leave next week, and they were all, asking about, well, do we have to take a COVID test when we come back to the
Mhm.
US? And we do not. And so that's, as far as restrictions go, they're pretty minimal. New Zealand and Australia were some of the longest holdouts. And then I went back to New Zealand in October of last year, and we did not have to take a test or anything. There was kind of a COVID form you had to fill out electronically to go to New Zealand, but as far as I understand, they've lifted all of that as well. So I think that even those countries that were among the most strict during the pandemic have really ultimately lifted most of their requirements at this point. So travel definitely has bounced back, and I've seen it across the industry. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are agents in other states, and everybody is just kind of seeing record breaking requests and numbers for new trips. And so it has definitely come back, and I think that yeah, I think some, trying to find the silver linings of the pandemic, people are just
Mhm.
ultimately not wanting to put off those trips anymore. You never know
Right.
when the world will shut down and you won't be able to. So
Yep.
I'm really seeing a lot of that, and planning a lot more of those bucket list kinds of trips.
Okay. So my last question for you today, if you can answer this, um,
Yeah.
when let's say Thanksgiving, Christmas coming up this year, people thinking about planning ahead for travel during those times. And I know you said that, and I didn't know this, 11 months is when they release flights. I always wondered that. I go look online, like, why can't I look 3 years ahead of time? Well, of course they're not going to have everything there, but
Right.
so what would you say the rule of thumb is for anyone who's thinking about wanting to work with you for travel for Thanksgiving or Christmas? How far in advance should they start talking to you so that they have their best options for like flights, hotel accommodations, anything like that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's all kinds of schools of thought on this out there. Ultimately, in my experience, particularly for popular travel times like spring break, Thanksgiving, Christmas, these really popular times of year to travel that are also historically the most expensive times of year to travel
Mhm.
because everybody is traveling at that time. In my experience, the sooner you can
Okay.
start looking and make those reservations, the better. And I find that to be, I mean, so flights, most airlines, Southwest is the exception. Most airlines release their flight schedules 11 months prior to travel. Um, Generally, I find, don't book your flights the day that the flights come out. Because Delta might release their schedule one day, and then American and United might wait 2 or 3 days. So it's usually somewhere within that 331 days prior to travel, basically. So I don't know. I guess in my experience, the sweet spot is kind of 10 months prior.
Okay.
And you'll read all kinds of, I mean, you can go online and like anything else, you can find, for, I'll say 10 months. Somebody else will say, oh no, it's 6 months or it's 4 months. But, especially now post pandemic where there's fewer flights operating than there were before, it's really just simple supply and demand as far as I see it. So, there's 200 seats on a plane.
Mhm.
As those seats fill up for a certain set of dates, the price increases on the remaining seats. So, generally speaking, if you have the advance notice and you can plan in advance, you're going
Mhm.
to get the best availability in terms of the flights going to your destination, but also the best price before the seats start to fill up on the plane.
Okay. So in other words, anybody watching this video, if they want to travel for Thanksgiving or Christmas, because I'm sure spring break will be done and gone by the time people see this, but they've got to reach out now.
Now, I mean, yeah,
Get
really,
going.
truly. And I mean, you're right. I mean, it's the day of recording this, it's February 16th. I'm getting requests for spring break still today,
Right.
yesterday, which is end of March, beginning of April. And I'm telling people, of course there's still options out there. I can help you, but I think it used to be it was used to be more likely that you could get a last minute deal when it came to travel. That is really just not the case anymore. Things are filling up.
Okay.
And so there's really no such thing as a last minute deal, particularly for those spring break, Thanksgiving, Christmas
Yep.
break times of year. So absolutely. I mean, if you're looking for Thanksgiving or Christmas time travel, February, March is a good time to be kind of starting to
Thinking
think
about
about those plans.
it. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. This was such good information. And I know that my husband and I have been talking about different travel things that we want to do and just knowing how the process works. I don't ever want to have to plan something myself ever again. It's too much. So,
Well,
um,
you're welcome. Thank you for having me. And that is what I hear from people very often is the internet is a great tool for research, but
mhm,
it's information overload. There's like,
yeah.
and there's some statistic out there about the average number of minutes that someone trying to plan a trip on their own online. The amount of time that they spend is like astronomical, and it's the reason we hire any professional to do
Mhm,
anything. You're an expert in law. I'm not gonna, I mean, not that I could do a lot of those things on my own, but yeah, ultimately, I mean, hiring someone who does it all day, every
yep.
day, they're going to be able to cut down on those hours of research. And so, yeah, it's just, it's having the expertise of someone who does it every day, and I think it makes a big difference.
Yep. It just makes sense. So, okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
I will have all of your contact information in the caption of this video. And if anybody's looking for help planning a trip, you've got to reach out to Kim. If you are interested in being featured on the Follow Friday series, you can send me an email at Katrina@cornerstonelegalpllc.com. Thank you all for watching.